Good morning and happy Sabbath to each one of you. It's a privilege to be here. I appreciate Pastor Don inviting me. And I'd like to tell you a bit of a situation that occurred to me about a year and a few months ago. But before I do that, there's a lot of scary things in this world, things that people are frightened of, things that really terrorize you. One of the things that popped into my mind is a lot of people are afraid of spiders. A lot of people are afraid of snakes. A lot of people are afraid of the dark. But I read on Google that there's one thing that more people are afraid of than anything else, and that's dying. People are afraid of death. And everything that we are afraid of, someone has came up with a fancy name and they call it a phobia. And the fear of dying or the fear of death is called thanatophobia. I had never heard of that before, but it's thanatophobia. And I want to share my experience with you when I was feeling a little bit under the weather. Back in November of 2023, usually in November, I'll go up to our cabin in the Caribou and I'll winterize it, get it ready for winter, and put the snowplow on the ATV so we can plow the driveway when we're up there, and cut a little bit of firewood so we can have fires going when we do go up there for around Christmas time. So I went up there November the 10th, which was midweek. I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. Went up to our cottage, and everything was fine. So I am in the garage, and I grabbed the snowplow, which is standing off to the side, and I reached down, picked it up, and carried it over to the ATV. And the plow only weighs 150 pounds, and I've done that every year for 20-some years. And as I was lining the plow up on the front of the ATV, I got this shooting pain from this wrist all the way up my arm, across my back, and down to this wrist. And at the same time, I just dropped the plow. I lost all muscle skill, muscle ability, and I got really, really hot. But I didn't get dizzy or anything. My chest didn't hurt. So I thought, well, this can't be that good. So I couldn't pick up the snowplow because I was still in pain. So I went inside the cottage and I put a movie in the TV and relaxed in my recliner, kicked back, got a glass of juice. And I watched, I forget what movie it was, but I watched it for about 30 minutes. And as fast as the pain came on, it disappeared, and I was absolutely fine. And I thought, well, I must have pulled a muscle. I am getting older. I'm not in my 20s anymore, and maybe that's what it was. So I went back down to the garage, grabbed the plow, picked it up again, put it on the ATV, and pinned it in place. I then plowed the driveway a bit because there was about 4 or 5 inches of snow. And then I grabbed the axe and I split half a cord of wood, not thinking anything of it. And then the next morning I got up early at my usual 4 a.m. and drove the 5.5 hours back to our home in Mission with no issues. Everything was absolutely fine. And I thought, well, that's strange. I must have pulled a muscle or a nerve or something like that. But I'd never experienced that before. So about 2 weeks later, we're sleeping in bed, and I wake up at 2 in the morning, and I can't breathe. My breathing is labored. I couldn't get any breath in, and I was just suffocating. So I got out of bed, and I found that if I sat on the edge of the bed, I could breathe a little bit and get a bit of air into my lungs. But if I tried to lay down on my side or my stomach or my back, I couldn't breathe. It was just like my lungs had a 100-pound weight on top of them. So the rest of that night, I just sat up. I found that if I sat upright on the couch, I put a blanket over my shoulders to keep me warm, and I could breathe a little bit. But the harder I tried to breathe, the less air got into my lungs, and the more panic-stricken I became. So in the morning, nothing had improved. It was the same thing. I couldn't eat. I had no appetite. I could only drink a little bit. My wife made me a piece of toast with butter, which I was able to eat. It took about a half an hour to eat it. That entire day was the same. There was no improvement. Went to sleep that night, sitting up on the couch with a blanket over my shoulders. Same thing, woke up the next day, same thing, could hardly breathe. And then the third day comes along, no improvement. It's exactly the same thing. And being a typical guy, we don't really need to see the doctor because we self-heal. Whereas if a woman breaks a nail, it's like emergency time. But a guy, we're a little tougher, it seems, or at least we think we are. So the third day, I was not getting any better, and my wife says, we have to go to see the doctor. So she phoned the doctor for me, and whether I wanted to go or not, I had no choice. She was taking me. So we went from our house in Mission over to our doctor in Abbotsford, and he checked my lungs and my heart with a stethoscope to see what was happening. And he said, well, you've got some fluid on your lungs. That's probably why you can't breathe. I'm going to prescribe a puffer for you. And he says, this puffer should last you 3.5 weeks, and you just give two squirts into your mouth. He told me how to use it, and that'll expand your lungs and allow them to get more air into them. So we went next door to the pharmacy. They filled the prescription for the puffer, and we went home. And after 2.5 days, I'd used up the entire puffer, which was supposed to last for 3 weeks, because my lungs just weren't letting any air come in. And then it got more complicated in that I couldn't walk more than 20 feet at a time without being out of breath, and I'd have to stop and rest and walk another 15 to 20 feet and stop and rest. So once again, being a guy, I waited for a few more days. I figured maybe it takes a while for the puffer to kick in, and it didn't work. So once again, my wife phones the doctor and says, we have to come in again and see you. It's the same thing. So she drove me back to the doctor's office. And the doctor checked my lungs, checked my heart again, and he said, well, you're not any better. And I said, well, I know that. And he prescribed another puffer for me. So we went to the pharmacy next door, filled that prescription for the puffer, and off we went back home. And 3 more days went by, and I wasn't getting any better, and the puffer was emptied again. That new puffer was gone. And I still couldn't breathe. I couldn't eat. I'd already lost 9 pounds just because I couldn't eat it all. Now, for women, that would be the awesome diet. It saves you a lot of money on Jenny Craig, but it wasn't the way I wanted to lose the weight, to be honest with you. So I phoned my doctor this time on Thursday afternoon about 3 o'clock when I knew I was not getting any better. And he said, come on in right away, I'll take a look at you. He says, just knock on the door because we'll be closed by then, but come on in. So Karen drove me over to the doctor's office. I made it inside. The doctor checked my lungs out, checked my heart, and he says, well, you're not getting any better. And I says, yes, thank you for your evaluation. It's greatly appreciated. And I said, what do you suggest? I said, there's one other thing that's a little bit odd. I said, my feet have swollen up like clown's feet. They're huge. And I says, I don't understand what's going on there. So he says, okay, you need to go to the Mission Hospital and get some x-rays and get some blood work done. And he says, once they do that, they'll send me the results and I'll phone you with what they say is wrong. So by the time we got out of the doctor's office, it was about 5:30. And by the time we got to Mission Hospital, the lab had closed, so we couldn't get the x-rays or the blood work done on Thursday evening. So Friday morning, my wife took me to the hospital in Mission, and they did some x-rays, they took some blood work, and sent me on my way. And I was waiting to hear from my doctor all day long, and finally at 4:30, he phoned me. And he says, well, I've got your results back, and it's not looking too good. And I said, okay, what's the deal? And he says, well, it looks like your heart is failing. So he says, you've got 2 options. You need to go to the Abbotsford Hospital because they have a cardiac ward there. And he says, I'll phone the cardiologist and have him waiting there for you. Or you can stay home and you'll probably be dead by the morning. And I said, well, I picked the first way. I picked the first option. And he says, get over there right now. So my wife drove me to the Abbotsford Hospital. They had a wheelchair and a cardiologist waiting there for me. He took me into the emergency room and put me in a bed, and then the cardiologist checked my lungs and checked my heart with a stethoscope. And he says, you're not looking too good. And I said, well, thank you very much. I said, what can you do about this? And he says, well, we need to do tests. So they did a CT scan, and they did an echocardiogram, which is basically, they measure the capacity of your heart to pump blood out. And a good rating for a heart, they call it the ejection fraction. the good rating for your heart to be able to pump blood out is 55 to 65%. If your heart pumped all the blood out with every beat, you would die. You'd be dead because there'd be no blood left. It's kind of like siphoning a gas out of a gas tank on a car. You use a hose and you got to pull it out, in and out of the gas tank. And once you get down too low, there's no more gas to be sucked out. So he says a healthy heart is 55 to 65% for your ejection fraction, which they called an EF. He says yours is at 10%. And he says basically this, at 25%, that's heart failure. At 10%, that's as close to death as you can get without actually dying. So he says, we really need to get you on some medication and try to strengthen your heart. And they had been giving me medication. They started these tests at 5 o'clock on Friday evening. And by 1 in the morning, Sabbath morning, they had finished giving me all the tests. And they had me on quite a stringent cocktail of different drugs to help my heart and try to help me feel a little better. And I was feeling a bit better. So I told the cardiologist, well, I'm feeling better. I think I can go home now. And he says, you're not going anywhere. He says, if you go home, he says, you might as well make your arrangements with the funeral home in the morning because you're not going to live. So they kept me in the hospital. They put me in the cardiac ward. And the nurses there were just fantastic, really great people. And they took really good care of me. So it was determined that they couldn't operate on me to put stents in my heart in order to get blood flowing better because my heart was too weak. And he says, you wouldn't survive. You would die on the operating table. So we have to keep giving you medication to get your heart to be stronger, to get your EF rating up to at least between 20 and 25% to allow us to operate on you. So I was in the hospital for 14 days before my heart got strong enough that they could operate. And during that time, I got to know the nurses really well because after 2 days of being in there, I had quite a bit more energy. I felt quite a bit better, but they wouldn't release me. They said, you've got to stay here. You've got to have the operation. And I've always been a very energetic person, and I don't need much sleep. I just need 4 hours of sleep every night. I've always been like that. And when I was younger, I could skip a night, so I could stay up for 36 hours and not be affected at all. And the cardiologist says, well, that's not good for you. And I said, well, I've been fine till now. And he said, well, you need to change your sleep habits. Because I'd usually go to bed about 10 o'clock in the evening and wake up at 2 in the morning, and that's good. And with my business, I would do computer work from 2 in the morning till 6 in the morning when my wife got up. So I got a good part of my day taken care of with my business already before the world started turning. So I would go to sleep at 10 p.m., wake up at 2 a.m., and I would wander the cardiac unit and talk to the nurses and visit with them. And in the cardiac care unit, they always have a heart monitor attached to every person in there so that they can tell what's going on. And that device sends a signal to a central station where there's a nurse always monitoring all the heart monitors. And I found out that if you go past these double doors and you go out of the cardiac unit, your heart monitor can't send a signal through to the main center that's monitoring everything. So I went for a wander down the hallway, and there was a Starbucks down there. And I didn't know it, but because I got out of the zone, this heart monitor wasn't recording or sending a signal, and all the nurses were very frantic trying to find me. They thought I had died because my monitor went flat. And I come back with a cookie from Starbucks there, which was down in the base or in the level of the hospital. And man, I got a tongue lashing from them, I'll tell you. They were not happy. They said, you do not leave past those doors. You do not go there. Do you understand? And I said, yes, I understand. So that was a very important lesson I learned. But as I would walk around the unit, I would talk to the nurses, talk to 3 or 4 each evening, and there were between 6 and 8 on the day shift, 6 or 8 on the night shift. And I would ask them, how long have you been a nurse? Was this your calling? Is this what you always wanted to do? Do you have any family members in the healthcare system? What do your parents do? Do you have siblings? What do they do? And I would get to learn about these nurses. And they really appreciated someone taking a personal interest in them. And some of them got to be pretty good friends, and they're still good friends today. They still call me to see how I'm doing and make sure everything's good, and it's very kind of them. But there was one nurse in particular that I hadn't gotten to yet, and two of the nurses actually had uncles or brothers that were into old classic cars, which I'm interested in. So she and I, one of the nurses and I got to be having a lot of conversations about old muscle cars and classic cars and things like that. So it was quite nice to have someone who was having the same interests as me. But I had made my rounds and got to talk to almost all the nurses except for this one nurse. And we'll call her Sarah. And she was the one that was monitoring all the heart monitors. And I came over to her after I'd been in there about 10 days, I guess, and visited with her about 3 in the morning. And I said, "Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm just coming over to talk to you." And she says, "I wondered when you were going to get to me. You've talked to everybody else but me." And I guess the nurses talk, and they say, "Hey, there's this nice guy here, you know, he's friendly, and you should talk to him, or he'll come talk to you." So I asked Sarah, "How long have you been a nurse?" And she said, 9 years. And I said, "Well, that's great." I said, "Was this always your calling?" And she says, no, it wasn't." I said, "Well, what did you do before this?" And she said, "I was an exotic dancer." And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I said, "How did you make the change from exotic dancer to nurse?" And by looking at her, you could tell she had had some plastic surgery done, you might say, on the upper part of her body. So I guess exotic dancers that look a little more robust get better tips. And she says, "Well, I was on stage doing my routine. I was dancing. And this guy on a bar stool right in front of me by the stage, he just keeled over off of his stool and fell on the floor. And I had just taken my first aid refresher course about 3 weeks before. So I hopped off the bar and off the stage and started giving him CPR. And I kept doing that until the paramedics arrived. And she said when the paramedics arrived, they hit him with a defibrillator and brought him back to life. And they told me that I had saved his life. And if I wouldn't have given him CPR, he definitely would have died." And she says it was at that point where I knew I'd missed my calling in life up till now. So she put in her notice and she registered for UBC and took the 4-year nurses training course. And then after she completed that, she took 2 more years of specialized training to work in the cardiology department. And she got a job in the Abbotsford Hospital. So that was where she was working, and that's where I met her. And I said, "Wow, that's just amazing." I said, "How often does someone change their career that drastically?" And she was a very nice lady, nice person. Well, I'd been in there for 14 days, and the cardiologist came in and says, "Well, we're going to do another echocardiogram to see how strong your heart is," which they did. And he says, "Your heart's at 23% for your EF, for your ejection fraction." So he says, "I feel comfortable we could do the operation, put stents in your heart, and you'll probably live. You've got a really good chance." So I said, "Well, let's get it done." I said, let's do it. So they booked me for the next day. But the Abbotsford Hospital doesn't have a surgical unit that does heart surgery. So they had to ship me by ambulance to the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. And at the Royal Columbian, it's kind of different because where they do the heart surgery is right down in the basement in this big cement room, and right next to it is the morgue. So if you don't make it through the heart surgery part, it's just a quick skiff on your stretcher to where your final resting place is. I thought, okay, that's very interesting. I wish you hadn't have told me that before the operation. But anyway, the surgeon was quite the character. He says, "How come you're here?" I said, "Well, I'm feeling a little under the weather." And he says, "No, like, why are you here? What precipitated this? What caused you to come here?" I said, "I really don't know." I said, "I've never drank. I've never drank alcohol. I've never smoked. I've never done drugs. I don't drink caffeinated products like coffee or tea or pop. I'm about 95% vegetarian, so I eat pretty healthfully. I don't have any heart disease in my family." I says, "I don't know what it is." And he says, well, do you have any stress in your life? And I said, well, yeah, I've been married 33 years. What do you think? And I said, that kind of is a little stressful sometimes. He says, no, it can't be that. He says, I've visited you in your room. He says, I see your wife there every day visiting you, and you guys get along great. He says, that's not it. So I said, well, I have a lot of stress with my work. I've been growing the business much bigger the last 2 years, and it's a little stressful. And he said, well, you have to change. You've got to get rid of that stress or minimize it somehow. So he figured that's the cause of my heart issues. And when they did the echocardiogram to check my heart, on the left side, there was a blockage that was 99% blocked. So almost no blood was getting through. And just an inch and a bit above that was another 80% blockage. So they wheeled me in on the stretcher to this cement room, and they had a big screen TV up there, similar to that one, but it's facing down over the stretcher. And the surgeon says, do you want to be awake for this? Do you want to see what's happening, or do you want me to put you under? And I said, oh, I want to be awake. I said, this is cool. You know, this could be the last thing I see. So I'm laying on the stretcher on my back, and the surgeon's here. There's a nurse here, another nurse here, and there's a fellow up in a little booth that's videotaping the whole thing. And it was quite interesting. He dabbed a little bit of freezing on my wrist, and they put a cable right up through my arm, across my chest, and down into my heart. And on this particular arm, they had an IV in there, and they had what's called a contrast agent. I hope nobody's squeamish here, but this contrast agent, when they put it in your veins, it changes the color of your blood so that when you look on the TV, you can see the blood as a contrast compared to where all your veins and everything else is in your body. So then it shows exactly where the blockage is. So the surgeon knew how far to push the little wire that he went in with, and on the wire it had 3 stents on there, and it was quite interesting. You could see him pushing it into my heart, and he went past the first blockage, and he went into the second blockage. And from this arm, he would push this little trigger. It would blow up the stent. Then he'd release the pressure. Then he'd push the stent in a bit further, blow it up again, release the pressure, blow it up again. And when the blockage was clear, he blew the stent up quite a bit larger than before and just left it that way. And then he went to the other area that was blocked and did exactly the same thing. And it was really quite interesting. But one thing he neglected to tell me is that when they put that contrasting agent in, your temperature increases drastically. It felt like I was in a fire. It was just so hot. I just started sweating right away. But before he could get the second stent in, the contrast agent started to wear off. So they had to put another shot in my arm of contrast agent. And that made me even hotter. And I was just burning up. And I told the surgeon, I don't feel good. I am so hot. And he says, oh man, I forgot something. I go, what? What'd you forget? Because you're conscious. What'd you forget? He's, oh, I was supposed to give you the warnings. He says, I had to get you to sign a release in case you don't make it. He said, I forgot to get you to sign it. He says, well, I'll just tell you. He says, 1 out of every 100 people don't survive this operation. And I said, 1 out of every 100? That's not very good. He said, oh, did I say 1 out of every 100? He says, I meant 1 out of every 10,000. He says, that's what it is. I said, well, that sounds a lot better. And he was quite a character, you know. He liked to joke around. He was lighthearted. And I guess when you're doing something like that, playing with people's lives, you've got to have some kind of a release for the stress that must be involved in doing that. But he finished with the work that he had to do. I could see on the screen the little wire was being pulled right up through my body and out my arm. And I don't even have a little imperfection in my wrist where they put it through. It was quite amazing what they could do. So the ambulance came that evening at about 6 o'clock, picked me up at Royal Columbian Hospital, took me back to the Abbotsford Hospital, and brought me back to my room. And the next morning at 10 o'clock, my cardiologist came into the room, and he says, okay, you're good, you're ready to go home. And I said, what, already? And he says, yeah, there's no recovery period, it's fixed, it's done. It's like you get an oil change on your car, new oil, new filter, you're good to go. And I said, okay, you're the boss. So he says, you're gonna be on a cocktail of different pills and different drugs. Some of them you'll need to take for the rest of your life to keep your heart strengthened. and others you can stop. We'll tell you when you can stop taking them because your heart is in good condition. And when I was there, before they did the stents in my arm, or put the cable up through my arm, did the stents in my heart, they said, we've done another array of tests on you, and he says, your liver is shut down, your kidneys have stopped working almost, and your pancreas is not working, so you're a severe diabetic. Your insulin level is 17.2 on the scale, which a normal person, which most of you probably are, is down around 4.2 to 5 parts, roughly. So he says, you're going to be a diabetic for the rest of your life, and you have to take metformin and another drug for diabetes. I said, well, I don't understand that because I've never had any symptoms. My vision is great. I don't even need glasses. I'm healthy. I exercise. I jog. I mountain bike. I lift weights. He says, well, I can't tell you what else to say, but if you don't take these pills, you're not going to last. You're just not going to make it. So I said, okay, so I accepted the fact that I have to take all these pills, which I couldn't understand how it had happened. But the reason all of my vital organs had shut down, I found out later, or were shutting down, is because my heart wasn't pumping enough oxygenated blood to keep my body alive. And I was just slowly dying and slowly dying. And I'd been sick for a while, evidently, but I didn't know it. Because I lived a fairly healthy lifestyle, it took quite a while for the symptoms to show themselves. So after they had put the stents in, and he came into my room at 10 o'clock, he says, you're looking good, we're releasing you, I've signed your release forms, you're good to go. And I says, well, I'm pretty tired from yesterday, because that was a long day. You get picked up at 7 in the morning with the ambulance, you're not back until 9:30 that night. I said, I'm tired, can I have a little sleep before my wife comes? And he says, yeah, no problem. We'll just leave the heart monitor on you so that we don't disturb you. So I laid down in the bed, and the next thing I remembered, or the next thing I knew, was there was a nurse on this side of my stretcher and one on this side. They were both shaking my arms, and there was a nurse on top of me giving me CPR. And I just woke up so quickly, and I said, what's going on here? And the nurse that was on top of me was Sarah, the ex-stripper. So, and I woke up real quick, and I said, Sarah, what are you doing? My wife's going to be here. She's going to kill you. And so she says, you died. And I said, no, I didn't. I had a nap. And she said, no, you died. I said, no, I didn't. And this went back and forth for a little bit. And she sent another nurse out to the cardiac monitoring station, and they printed off the tape, which was basically a printed copy of what the heart device was showing. And it showed my heart had stopped for 16 seconds. So I guess she was right, you could say. I did actually die. When you're gone for 16 seconds, usually there's, some kind of brain malfunction. Your brain's not as sharp as it is, which my wife says it is anyway. But, there's usually something that is negative that you're not going to recover from mentally when your heart stops like that. But my heart, just with CPR, they were able to bring me back to life. And it was quite the experience, When you die, so many people are afraid of dying. And it's exactly as it says in the Bible. The living know that they will die, but the dead know not anything, in Ecclesiastes 9:5. And it's just a sleep, as we're told in the Bible that it is. You just go to sleep, and that's it. You don't know anything until Jesus comes, or until you get CPR from a stripper. One or the other. It could go either way, I guess. But the doctor came in, the cardiologist came in the room about 10 minutes later, and he says, well, if you're going to do stupid things like that, I've canceled your release, and you're not going anywhere. He says, we got to figure out what caused your heart to stop. And what was the issue here? Because they didn't know what it was. So they kept me in there for another 14 days. And they said, we're going to put a defibrillator in your chest. My heart had been working perfect for those 14 days. But if it would have happened when I was at home, I know I wouldn't have survived, because it's just my wife and I at home. And if I cut my finger and need a Band-Aid, she'll pass out. So never mind if someone stops breathing and dies. I mean, I'd be done. It'd be lights out for me. But So I stayed there another 14 days, and they brought a defibrillator by, and they showed me what it would look like. It's just a little thing about yay thick, about that wide, about that deep, just a tiny thing, and there's 3 wires coming out of it. And he says, what we'll do with this, it's different than a pacemaker, because your heart's working fine, but if your heart ever stops again, or goes into AFib, meaning beating irregularly, this defibrillator will trigger your heart and bring you back to life. So you'll never die of a heart attack. And the surgeon says, you might get hit by a bus and die that way, but your heart's never going to stop. He says, you'll be fine. So they took me back to Royal Columbian Hospital, and they cut a little incision right above my heart here. And first he says, do you want to see what's going on? And I said, well, yeah, it was the same guy that put the stents in. He says, I figured you would. You're a real sucker for punishment. And I said, well, I'm interested. And so they did a little incision just above my heart, and they fed 3 wires down in there, and they kind of like when you plug in your RCA stereo cables to your VCR or your surround sound system, but they're very tiny cables. They plugged these 3 cables into my heart and inserted the defibrillator into my chest and sewed me back up and put a bandage on it. And he says, okay, you'll be ready to go home tomorrow again. We'll give this a try. And with the defibrillator, the new technology they have is pretty amazing, because no matter where I am, this defibrillator sends a signal through to a satellite in the sky, which then sends a signal through to the Royal Columbian Hospital, which is the main monitoring center for British Columbia, and they know exactly where I am. So if my heart has an issue and this defibrillator engages, the Royal Columbian Hospital will know, hey, there's something wrong with defibrillator number such and such, whatever it is, and they'll phone me on my phone, they'll try to text me, and they'll email me. And if they can't reach me either way, they'll send a ground ambulance or an air ambulance to whatever the coordinates are that the defibrillator is sending to them. So the cardiologist told me that, and I said, well, that's kind of cool, but if you know where I am every minute of every day, I guess my bank robbing days are over then. I have to come up with a new career. But that was... I was in there for 30 days in the hospital. I was released January the 11th, and I've been in to have cardiology tests done and stress tests on the treadmill. And the last time I saw my cardiologist, which was about 2.5 months ago, he says, I don't want to see you again. He says, you're absolutely fine. He says, you're actually healthier than most people. And when they put me on the treadmill, I ran on the treadmill at the maximum speed for 1 hour and 40 minutes. And I wasn't even puffing or anything like that. He says, you're going to be just fine. Don't worry about it. And I attribute my survival to the Lord. I wasn't frightened of dying. I'd always read, in the scriptures that when you die, it's just to sleep. And that's exactly what it is. The scriptures are bang on. When you die, there's no pain as long as it's immediate. I mean, if you get hit by a bus or something like that, I'm sure there's some pain there. But if you just die, it's just drifting off in your sleep. You feel no pain, no discomfort. You just fall asleep. It's like a deep sleep. And that's how it'll be till the Lord comes and wakes us up to take us home. So it was quite an experience, one that I'm not really excited about repeating. I didn't change my diet much at all because we were pretty healthy. I have actually 3 months ago eliminated the pills for diabetes because my diabetes levels are right down to normal. My sugar levels, I should say, are down to normal because everything seems to be working. My heart, my lungs, my kidneys, my pancreas. I'm as healthy as I was when I was young. And the last time when I saw the cardiologist, he says, you've got the body of someone who's 20 years younger than you. I mean, I'm 61 now. He says, you're probably equivalent to a 40-year-old that's in good shape. So he says, you have nothing to worry about, and you're going to live a long life. So that's very comforting. So I appreciate you being patient and listening to my story. And death is nothing to fear, even though so many people fear it. Have a wonderful Sabbath.